Manning, retired pastor and teacher at Santa Cruz Community Church. We're here again Sunday morning to 9:30 to study the Bible and to study the book of Genesis. Last week we talked a lot about Jacob. We want to talk more about what that means to us this morning. So I hope you're able to follow and share in the discussion. Who God is and what God does and how I can relate to God. But we also are learning about ourselves, especially when you get to Jacob. I unfortunately see myself too much in Jacob, not enough in Abraham or Lot or Isaac, but too much in Lot and Jacob. So let's talk about Jacob. Have you learned some things in studying Genesis, or have you looked at something differently than you did before we were studying it this time? Is there something that jumped out at you as you were studying this, or something that kind of rattled around in the back of your awareness and you thought, what am I supposed to make of this? What do you make of Jacob? How do you understand Jacob as a person, as a character? We start out with Jacob hanging around home while his brother's out hunting game, and think, maybe I'm more like Esau than like Jacob. No, I'm more like Jacob. But then we get into this business of him buying, as it were, the birthright from his brother, and yet over and again it said he stole it from his brother. I mean, it wasn't really a good transaction. His brother really didn't understand what he was dealing with. So then this Jacob guy grows up, and here, if you're going to compare yourself to Jacob, you're going to compare yourself to Jacob as the kid growing up. I see most of us have experiences. Either we grew up in a household where Christianity was taken for granted, where the scripture was known, or maybe we grew up in a household where it wasn't. And yet, if you grew up, I have a little book that I like to read called Growing Up Born Again. Have you seen that little book? Kind of makes fun of a lot of the cliche kind of things that went on in growing up. How did you have this picture on your wall when you were growing up? Did your parents say this to you when you were growing up? Abraham grows up in a purely secular society, a society that knows nothing about the true God, apparently, from what the archaeologists find in digging into those ancient societies. And we run across something in the Bible and we say, I don't understand that. And then the archaeologist says, no, it was normal. That's what everybody did in that day and age, from what we've dug up and read. So Abraham, what strikes us about Abraham is this ultimate faith. That's what when we read about Abraham in the New Testament, it's that faith that God called him, and he had no really good background understanding about who God is. He was plowing new ground. This was an unknown thing, and that's what it is about Abraham, that God called him and said, come on, Abraham, go where I tell you and do what I tell you, and Abraham did. Now, I don't quite see myself in that picture very well. And then here's Lot. Lot grows up in Abraham's shadow. He grows up with this as just normal for him. And he's kind of a middleman. We don't see anything except for the fact that Lot, as a boy, has taken up that hill, and he says to Dad, hey, here's the wood and here's the fire and here's the knife, but where's the lamb? You know, I don't think I'd want to be Lot at that time.
Honey, that's not Lot.
No, not Lot. I'm sorry. Sometimes my brain thinks one thing and my mouth says something else. Isaac. So I don't think I'd want to be Isaac at that point. But Isaac must have developed some significant concepts of faith in going through that. And then Isaac is just there till we see him as an old man trying to deal with his two boys. Then along comes Jacob. And I see myself a lot more in Jacob. And I wonder what you see in Jacob. He gets into all of this with his brother. His brother's going to kill him because his brother sees him as stealing all his things, though the brother didn't care anything about it when Jacob was stealing it at the beginning. Then he flees. We did talk a little bit about this last time. His mother's, who is programming all this, and you excuse Jacob because you say it was his mother's doing, or else you say, I don't care what mom said, Jacob. You know you shouldn't go into your father and lie to him and say, I'm Esau, and I want the blessing. So now he's leaving home, and everything he's ever known, he's leaving behind. And the first night he gets to this place that's strange to him, and it's just a way stop on the way of where he's going. He lays down and he needs something to hold his head up so it won't be flopping on. So he finds this rock and puts it under his head. Now you get an idea of what size rock this was. He can use it for a pillow. And he goes to sleep, and he's I'm thinking about what's going on in his life. Mom and dad and everything he knew is back there. He's alone, going through country with people around him that he doesn't know anything about. And in the night he has this dream, and he sees a stairway or a ladder, sometimes it's called, going up to heaven, and angels going up and down on it. Now, what does he know about what an angel looks like or what an angel is? I'm not sure. Even Abraham doesn't deal with angels that much. Certainly Isaac doesn't deal with angels that much. So, but he sees these angels, and at the top of it, he sees an image of God. Now, what does God look like to Jacob? I don't know. But God, he wakes up in the morning and he says, whoa, what was that? And he says, this must be the very house of God, the very gate of heaven. And I thought, really? If you get into science fiction and so forth, or even outside of science fiction, you go to the mystery spot. This is something that's out of kilter, except there's one just like it in Southern Oregon called the Oregon Vortex. And you realize, no, this is just sort of tricking my senses. There's nothing really miraculous here. But Jacob says, this must be the house of God, this place. This must be this special place. So he takes that rock and he sets it up and pours oil on it and says, this will be the house of God. Now, it's called Bethel all the way through the book of Genesis, and yet Jacob named it Bethel. It was just out in the middle of a field. There was a village close by called Luz that disappears, and Bethel becomes the place. And yet, nobody ever builds a cathedral there. Nobody ever does anything there. In the New Testament, Bethel is never mentioned particularly. For Jacob, it was such a wondrous place. Have you ever had such a place in your life? Oh, I went to camp, and I was up in the woods, and it was marvelous. And everybody was talking about God, and we were singing these wonderful songs. It was just so great. If I could just go back to that campground, that's the place where God is, really. So anyway, then he goes on, and for 20 years, he's way up there with Uncle Laban. And I've been reading J. Vernon McGee. You ever read J. Vernon McGee? Liz used to listen to J. Vernon McGee on the radio with his Through the Bible as she was driving to work and to church and stuff. I like to read J. Vernon McGee, and I think to myself, my middle name is Vernon. I could be J. Vernon Heberling. I could be the world's great teacher. No, not really. J. Vernon McGee is a very interesting guy. He comes out of, I think, like Oklahoma, and he's got this folksy kind of thing about him, and yet he's a serious scholar, and he takes a church in Los Angeles, and you get this picture from that he's talking about in Los Angeles, men and women swim in the swimming pool together. We didn't do that in Oklahoma. From going, you can see that poor J. Vernon has almost slipped a cog here, going from his boyhood in Oklahoma and what was taken for granted and ending up in Los Angeles. And yet he talks in a way that gets to you. And reading the story of Jacob with J. Vernon McGee, he points out these things that what's going on here, So Jacob, J. Vernon McGee believes that when God says in Galatians, you reap what you sow, he thinks that that's exactly what happens. He says Jacob sowed the idea of being clever and working things out to his advantage. Then he goes up and he finds out that Uncle Laban is better at that than he is. And he gets back what he gave. So 20 years with Uncle Laban, and he says, okay, Uncle Laban says, hey, Jacob, it's nice to have kin here living with this. That's a wonderful thing, but what do you want for a salary and what do you want for a job? I have a job for you. And young Jacob says, I love your daughter. I want your daughter. I'll work 7 years. Sevens just are all through the Bible. What's special about 7? Something. I'll work 7 years for you and then I'll marry your daughter. So he works the 7 years. And then he wakes up in the morning and finds out that Uncle Laban gave him the wrong girl. Somebody's cleverer at doing things than you were, Jacob. So he says, well, I'll work 7 more years for the right girl. So all of this happens then, and he has all these children. And I was trying to figure out how old were these children these boys. Can you imagine poor Jacob with a house full of teenage boys, 11 of them? Jacob is not really the epitome of a family man. I'm sure the boys had trouble figuring out who Dad was, and Dad had a lot of trouble figuring out who the boys were. But I tried to figure out how old these boys were by going back and figuring out how I'm realizing that the story of the birth order sort of puts them all in order one after another, and yet we know that it takes almost a year to have a child, and there's only there's 7 years after he's married both the wives, and most of these boys are born in 7 years. Now he ends up with 4 wives because each of his 2 wives give him their nurse as the second wife. You think, well, that's the way God wants it to be? And I don't think so. Read how well it worked out for Jacob. I don't think it worked out all that well. So there must be some overlap here, that he couldn't have had all those kids in 7 years without there being some overlap. So we see that sometimes the story we're reading is put in a way so we can understand it, but there's more to it that we're not being told. So anyway, then he comes back, he decides it's time to go home. Well, God tells him it's time to go home. He first wants to go home, and Uncle Laban talks him out of it and says, oh, no, Jacob, since you've been, I was just a poor man with a few sheep when you came, and now I'm a wealthy man with all these herds, and it's all because of you. I think Laban, at one point, Laban says he figured he did it by divination. Now, divination is kind of manipulating the spirits to find out what they're saying. But he said, essentially what he means is, I figured out that anything you put your hand to succeeds, because somehow God, and Laban knew about God, he knew about Abraham's God. Somehow God is doing this with you. So I love J. Vernon McGee. I was talking about this thing of, the story says that he took these branches and peeled the bark off so that there were stripes of white showing through, and put those in front of the sheep, and so the sheep all had striped offspring. J. Vernon McGee says, I have no idea how this happened except that God did it. He said, I don't know whether the branches did anything, or whether Jacob just thought they did. But anyway, at the end of 6 more years of working for Uncle Jabin, he's got, though he complains that Laban kept changing he says 10 times he changed the deal of what my wages were, and yet every time Laban changed it, the change worked out in Jacob's favor. So then Jacob takes all of his flocks and herds, and you have to understand, this was an ancient culture that's not the culture we live in or approve of. But along with all those flocks and herds came servants who took care of them. Jacob didn't take care of all these. He had people who took care of them. So he and all of his people and his flocks and his wives and his kids start back home. And Laban, it takes 3 days. Laban, he did this when he saw Laban was off to shear his sheep, so he knew he would be away for a while. But finally somebody comes to Laban and says, Jacob's gone with all of the stuff. And Laban would say, that stuff was all really mine. They were my daughters, they're my grandchildren, they were my sheep, and Jacob stole them from me. Jacob himself says, I came here with only a stick in my hand, and I leave with all this. Laban goes after him, gathers up the neighbors, so he has a little mini army and goes after Jacob. It takes him a week to catch up with him because Jacob had a head start. Finally, there's this confrontation, and Jacob realizes that I'm in real trouble here. Laban is so they work it out, and finally at Mizpah they separate because God says to Laban, watch what you're doing here. It's interesting what God says to Laban. Don't say to Jacob either good or bad. You want God to give you a clear instruction. His instruction to Laban was, don't say to Jacob either good or bad. Just leave him alone. Stay away from him. So they part, and they put up this pillar that says, I won't cross to be up where you are, and you don't cross to be down where I am. We're just going to leave each other alone. So then Jacob keeps going, and finally then, after 20 years, he's returning with all of this, returning home, and he says, but what about Esau? So he sends some servants, remember from last week, and they go and they find Esau. I'm not sure whether Esau was in where Abraham and Isaac were, whether he already has moved. Some texts make it look like he already had moved to find a place for his family. But anyway, the servant comes back and says to Jacob, I told your brother that you were coming home, and he's coming to meet you with 400 men with him. And Jacob says, oh my gosh. Last thing I know about Esau, he said, I'm going to kill you. And now he's coming with 400 men. So we have this interesting story of Jacob sending presents to Esau, and then finally dividing the family up so if Esau attacks one part of the family, maybe the other part can get away. And you see how, as a father, he puts the handmaids and their children out in front. They don't mean as much to him. And he puts his first wife, as it were, out with her kids. She has most of the kids. And finally, there's Rachel. Rachel has always been his real wife, his true wife. And she has only the one child, Joseph, little Joseph, just beginning to grow up. And he went, and then Jacob stays back, and now, what do you make of this? And he's all alone. He's sweating out what's going to happen. He's really nervous. Ever been there? I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't know. And all of a sudden, there's this being. It says a man who attacks him in a way. And you've been watching the Olympics. They're having a wrestling match. These two guys. Jacob is a big, strong man, but this is a big, strong man, and they're wrestling. If you watch a wrestling match in the Olympics, I mean, they can go for a long time and you don't see anything moving except muscles are rippling, and so all night long they're struggling. And as dawn begins to come on, the being, the man, who's wrestling with Jacob, says, okay, enough of this, and he reaches out and he touches Jacob on his hip, and all of a sudden his hip is out of joint, and with one leg not usable and the hip out of joint, he's losing the battle. So what does he do? He grabs a hold of his wrestling companion. The wrestling companion says, let me go. And he says, no, not until you bless me. Jacob has figured out this is not just some wandering stranger who came along here to fight with me. This is something more. And so the stranger says, okay. And then Jacob says, who are you? What's your name? And he says, why are you asking my name? What's going on here? And finally, the stranger who was wrestling with Jacob says, what's your name? And he says, Jacob. Now, Jacob means a tricky guy, a guy you wouldn't want to buy a used car from, a sneaky sort of person. And that's what his name means. And the person who's wrestling with him says, you won't be called Jacob anymore. Now you'll be called Israel. And Israel means struggled with God, wrestled with God. So again, like he did on his first episode with the dream about the ladder, he wakes up, he gets done with this all-night wrestling match, and he says, I have wrestled with God. And he then crosses this little Jabbok River that flows into the Jordan. If you see a map of this, he's on the other side of the Jordan. And Esau shows up, and Esau greets him like a long-lost brother, because as a matter of fact, that's what he is. Oh, they hugged, everything's fine. And Esau says, come on, Jacob, let's go home together. And Jacob says, I've got all these kids and stuff. You go. You men are all riding animals. You go. I'll see you there. But he doesn't go straight down the way Esau went. He crosses the Jordan and he heads back toward Bethel. Now, what's going on here? Now, on the way, he stops a couple of times. Jacob says, why is he stopping? He knew what he should do. And one of the places he stops is Shechem. Now, if you look at the map, Shechem is a little north, so he heads north to a place for his flocks and herds, and he buys a piece of property from the people in Shechem. Now, this is one of these chapters you don't want to ask your kids to read. And they have 11 boys and one girl. Now, Jaber and McGee says, oh, surely they had more girls than that. They just didn't talk about it. I'm saying, I don't know. When would they have had more girls? I'm not sure how they had all these boys, even with 4 wives in the time. So the scripture says that one girl, Dinah, and I don't know how, I'm trying to figure out how old are these people. They must be just in their late teens. They can't be much older than that, because this is only 20 years and 7 of it he didn't have any children. So they must be just in their late teens, but they're teens. Teens are very unpredictable. Some of the people we see doing amazing things at the Olympics are just in their late teens. So he stops by Shechem, he buys this property, and now I don't know, I've tried to figure out, where does this well come from that's mentioned with Jesus stopping at Sychar, and the woman from Samaria comes out to the well and she says, "This is Jacob's well. Jacob gave us this well." I can't find anything in Genesis that explains where this well came from. Shechem is not the right place for Sychar. Sychar is much further south. So anyway, while he's there then camping, I don't know what maybe he's putting off going back to Bethel. Maybe he's kind of trying to sort all this out in his mind. But while he's there, his teenage daughter Dinah says, "Oh, I'm going to go to town and meet these people." And the prince of the city sees her. She must be a beautiful young lady like her grandmother and her great-grandmother. And so now, J. Vernon McGee says, read the text and figure out what went on here. Actually, he raped her. That's the term. The Bible doesn't use that term, but that's the term J. Vernon McGee says. So then he decides, he wants to marry this girl. So now Jacob has now gone from being the guy who's pulling all the strings to the father whose kids are pulling the strings, and he's trying to figure out what in the world to do with this. So he waits till the boys come in from their tasks, and he tells them what happened, and the boys are angry, really angry. But they have enough of their father in them that they say, let's figure this out. So Abraham was given this rite of circumcision that was kind of a difficult thing for us to deal with, and yet it was this mark on all the men of the mark that the inheritance was being watched over by God. So it was a very sacred mark that they had. But these boys say to the men of Shechem, the father of the family, the head of the city says, we want to marry, I want my son to marry your daughter, and we'll just become one big happy family here. And the men of the city say, look at all the sheep those guys have. Look at all the camels and donkeys. Yeah, let's marry into them, and they've got a whole lot more than we do. We'll just absorb it. It'll all be ours. So the boys say, we can't intermingle with you because you're not circumcised. Sometimes we sort of play with these sacred things in strange ways. So the men of the city said, okay, that's what it takes, that's what we'll do. So I don't know how many we're talking about. This is a small village, I think. But the men all are circumcised. And this leaves them kind of indisposed. They're sore, they're healing. Meanwhile, these 2 teenage boys, young men, take their swords. Now, they're not soldiers, but they figured this out somehow. They go into town and surprise everybody. This all seemed to be so these men in the city are not armed and ready. The boys come in and they kill all these guys. They take instead of the city people taking their flocks, they take everything that the city people had. And Jacob says to them, "Ooh, what you've done! Look around. We're strangers in this land. when everybody hears about what you've done, they're all going to gang up on us and we'll be dead ducks. But the text says God put the fear of God in all of them. And Jacob now moves on. He goes back to Bethel. And now he says to his family, and we had that little incident with Rachel stealing the household gods. He says, you've got these idols with you. Give them to me. He collects all of their gods. A missionary once told me that in Japan, every household has a god shelf. And they have Buddhist things on it, Shinto things. And in Japan, if you want to have a wedding, maybe you want to have a Shinto wedding because Shinto is more, woo, this is fine. If you want to have a funeral, you want to have a Buddhist funeral because the Buddhists know how to do funerals. But you have your God shelf. This missionary said, if we would have just let them put a cross on their God shelf, we could have converted the whole nation of Japan. But no, we wouldn't let them do that. If you're going to be a Christian, you got to get rid of the God shelf. They weren't about to do that. So anyway, Jacob says, give me all these idols, and he buries them. What's happening here? But he doesn't stay at Bethel. He leaves and goes back down to the southern part of Palestine or Canaan or the Holy Lands, where Abraham and Isaac had been, where Isaac still is. So, what I'm wanting to talk about is, do we see something of kind of a conversion kind of thing, a coming of age with faith kind of thing with Jacob? He really doesn't know much about God, but he has a confrontation with God as a young man before his life unfolds. But he talks big about it. Oh, this is the house of God and the gate of heaven, and God speaks to him and says, I'll give you the same covenant blessing that I gave to Abraham and to Isaac. It's interesting because Abraham and Isaac were very different characters than Jacob, and yet Paul says God has a right to choose, and he chose Jacob, and so he stays with Jacob even though Jacob takes a long time figuring this out. So Jacob says, if you'll bring me back, God said, I'm going to bring you back. We see something kind of happening here, and I think you don't want to overemphasize it, but when Abraham has now broken with everything else, and he's a stranger in this land, and yet he believes that God is going to give him this land, and that he's going to be the father of a large family. And so when it's time for Isaac to marry, he calls his best servant and says, I don't want Isaac to marry some of these local women. And yet, ask yourself, where did all these 12 brothers get their wives? We know Joseph married the daughter of the priest of Egypt. But where did the others get their wives? They married local women. But at Abraham's stage, God is saying, I don't want him to do that. And Esau marries local women, and Isaac says, and Rebecca especially says, this is not good. So marry women from the family stock. And yet it's not the marrying, that makes the difference. But God says to Jacob, don't stay, this is the land I put you in and I want you in. Go home, go back. So he goes back. And by the time he gets back, after all that he's been through, God has become much more real to him. And this idea of wrestling with God. Now, imagine in my life I've ever had a time when I've actually, I did wrestle when I was a boy, and I lost every match I ever had. I was not a wrestler. But I never wrestled all night with some figure that I knew was God. And yet, how many times have I spent a lot of time in thinking, what in the world is going on with my life? What am I supposed to be doing? What does God want from me? What do I expect to have from God? And you see in this physical thing that happens to Jacob, something that happens to us emotionally and spiritually at times. Paul talks about the potter and the clay. The potter can make anything he wants from the same lump of clay. He can make different kind of vessels for different purposes. So Jacob is definitely a different kind of vessel than Abraham and Isaac were. But he's the one that God renames, and it's his name that hangs on to them, to the name of the nation at this very day. And yet that name means struggling with God. From Jacob on, that's what they did. They struggled with God. The whole nation struggled with God. And God struggled with them. Yet, how odd of God to choose the Jews. And yet, this seemed to be what he wanted to do, was deal with people in a very personal way. And is there something we're supposed to learn from this? So, let me ask you, in studying this now or studying it any time you have, what do you get out of all these Genesis stories, especially Jacob? What do you see in your own experience or in your own life that is illuminated in some way by Jacob and what he does and what happens to him? Anything? Why does God do this? Why does God show him up with angels climbing on it? Why does God wrestle with him all night? Is this the way God is supposed to deal with people? Is there something we're supposed to learn from this? Why does he go to Shechem and get into this thing? And I mean, God can't possibly approve. Somebody says, well, it's in the Bible, so God must approve of it. God did not approve of these boys tricking the Shechemite guys into being defenseless and then killing them and stealing their stuff. No. And yet God didn't throw in the towel and say, okay, Jacob, this was nice, but it's over now. I'm done with you. Somehow God kept at it. He had made a commitment to this man, and he'd made a commitment to these people. And Abraham has one son. Isaac has two, but only one is chosen. And now, if we're going to talk about developing this into a bigger thing, we need more people. So along comes Jacob with his 4 wives and 12 sons and 1 daughter. We sort of made a move to develop this into a bigger thing, and yet somehow there's a mixture of what we do and what God does, and yet God seems to stay with it and stay involved in it and see that it comes out where he wants it to come out somehow. Does he do that in your life? Something really puzzled me. I was reading along, and Jacob is heading home, and here's his favorite wife. Now, God seems to get involved in the birth of these children somehow. God seems to decide who's going to have children when. And so finally, God allows Rachel, the favorite wife, to have a son, Joseph. Joseph, we know the story, so we know this Joseph is going to be a very significant person. And yet, as Jacob is heading home with his one wife that he really loves, and her son Joseph that becomes his daddy's boy, his favorite, gives him that special coat, whether it's of many colors, or the translators say we're not too sure what this means. It's a special coat, though, that he has to show he's the special son. And yet, then Rachel is going to have a second son, and she has a terrible, women used to die in childbirth. I guess they still do, but less often now. But Rachel is having a terrible time, and she dies having this boy. And she says, "Name him the son of my sorrow." And Jacob says, "No, I'm going to name him Benjamin, the son of my joy, But anyway, he has just the two children. Benjamin is the littlest of the family. And Joseph now is growing up. He's a teenager. So he never gets home with that favorite wife. God blessed him in so many ways, and yet he seems to send him grief through this favorite wife. So he buries her on the wayside. The text says, I think this is interesting, the text says he set up a pillar over her grave, and that pillar is still here. Still here when? Still here when Moses writes this, still here when they come back after 400 years away and find this pillar still there. But anyway, he's heading home, and yet he's old man Jacob is really being shaped by God by some difficult things. He doesn't know what to make of these boys. And then there's a text that I found that said, as they were getting home there, they weren't quite home, that Rebecca's nurse died. We didn't know, and all we knew about Rebecca's nurse was that when the servant of Abraham came and invited her to come back with him and be Isaac's wife, she took her nurse along, and we're told that was custom, that a family who was substantial had nurses for each child. Did you wish your family had a nurse for each child? But the nurse went along then, and this nurse dies and is buried. And I think, why are we mentioning this? I would like to have, if I had been there, I would like to have been Abraham or Isaac, these special people. Maybe if I had been there, I would have been the nurse. The nurse has no children, but the nurse has spent a lifetime serving this family. Isn't that of God also? And is especially mentioned in Genesis when she dies. Now, I looked, and there's nothing in the text of the story that tells us when Rebecca died. But at the end of the story, it tells us that Rebecca, along with Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, and it says Rebecca they were all married, all buried in the same tomb that Abraham bought. So but I'm thinking maybe the text doesn't specifically say, but she must have died before Jacob got home. He was her special son. She was special to him, and yet he gets home, his father is still alive after these 20 years. But his mother seems to be gone from the picture. So, anyway, what do you learn from all of this? Is there something we're supposed to take away from these stories that are more than just history, more than just how God began it all? Something about the way God deals with human beings, the way he deals with his plan to start a family that would be a special family, and yet you know all the history. This special family never really seemed to, there are always people among them that are special people. Isaiah, Jeremiah, they're great special people. David, Solomon, yet even special people in the Bible all seem to have warts. They seem to have their bad side. What do we remember about David? He's a man after God's own heart, and he sinned, and he repented. Very few of them are people that have such a character that we don't find any flaws in them, which doesn't mean there were no flaws. It just means we're not told what the flaws were. So,
John, to me, I hear these stories that it strikes me is so different than the way I would have responded in so many ways. I mean,
right.
This whole thing with deceit with Jacob, with pretending he's his brother with his father, it seems so strange.
Yeah.
And then he says his brother, he's I'll meet you there, and his brother seems to be greeting him, although you don't know if there's some hidden purpose there. But yeah, I'll become. Then he goes the other way. I mean, that seems so strange. There's no. It just kind of they're like incomprehensible sometimes. What's happening here? It's not what I would have expected.
Right.
It's not what I would have done.
I would think. Tell me, class, I would think that in every one of our lives, if we look back and we went through our lives, there are things that happened in our lives that we say, now as I look back on it, God was in that. God was doing something in my life. God was letting me know that I'm one of His. I'm called for a purpose. Then there were also things in our lives, I'm sure, where we said, God, what are you doing? This can't be right. I mean, I'm your person. How can this happen to me? How can this happen to people I love? And yet, we see in Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, God does let things happen in the lives of people He loves. And sometimes those bad things that happen, God uses somehow to make this person's life and character what it should be, right? I don't want to tell personal stories, but it certainly, as I look at my life, I was kidding about if I was J. Vernon Heberling, maybe I could be a great teacher like J. Vernon McGee. Obviously, God never intended me to be a great teacher. I was a pastor. I thought I was a good pastor. There was a time in my young life when I said to God and to myself, this pastoring isn't that hard. I mean, this is kind of fun. This is nice. What's so difficult about this? Church was growing. Everything was going well. And then all of a sudden it wasn't going well. And I'm thinking, what happened here? I mean, same God, same people, it wasn't working. I realized you are not meant, God did not give you the ability or the desire really to be the great pastor, to have a big church, to have importance. I wonder if I could have managed that. I think God had to keep me humble. So I think, okay, here you are, old man John, you're sitting here teaching a handful of people, but these are a handful of God's people. I'm looking for lessons to learn from watching the Olympics, and I'm thinking, okay, so you could run faster than anybody in the world, and so you got a gold medal. Or maybe you could do something else, play ping pong better than anybody in the world and get a gold medal. Shoot targets and get a gold medal. Maybe you were one of a great team and everybody on the team got a gold medal. Even the people who sat on the bench and never played a minute got a gold medal. Isn't this odd? But this is the way things work. And people who, I watched all this thing about with the gymnasts, and I'm thinking, I think the media is kind of to blame here. That you saw all those commercials. This girl was supposed to go to the Olympics, and she was, one of the commercials made it look like she could jump 50 feet in the air and turn and turn and turn. She couldn't really do that. So she gets to the Olympics, and she's a good gymnast. She may be the best gymnast there. but she's not that much better than the other gymnasts. The difference between the ones that get the gold medal and the ones that get no medal sometimes is a tiny little difference. This is the world we live in. This is who we are. This is life. And where is God? Well, God is there. God is involved. I think Jacob, in a way, should be a real help to us to see that Jacob is far from the ideal person that we would want to, you were saying, right away we get acquainted with Jacob and say, his very name tells us that this is not the guy that we want our kids to pattern their lives after. And yet, God picked him, and God stays with him. And finally, we see this old man taken away into Egypt and dying in Egypt, and yet by now, he has become this patriarch. But it took him a long. Abraham seemed to get there in one way, and Jacob seems to get there in a very different way, but he ends up the patriarch. And from that time on, all these millions of people are going to say, we are the children of well, they don't say Jacob, they could say Jacob, but they say Israel. Mm-hmm. We are the people of Israel. We are the people who start back there with Jacob and then go through all our history, struggling with God, struggling to be who God wants us to be, who we think we ought to be. So,
John, I'd like to think that I'm speaking for all of us here by saying, you may not feel you're a great teacher with a great big congregation, but Santa Cruz is not probably going to produce a great big congregation, especially of elderly people. But to us, we're very fortunate. And I thank you. And I think back on, there are many great preachers that had great congregations who took huge falls.
Yeah.
I mean, look at what's happened.
Yeah.
And but I think of our little humble group here and your teachings here. Somehow you have a way of presenting things that cuts through it to me. I appreciate your style, and I think I've been blessed to have been a part of your Bible study. And I thank you for your life's work. It comes through, and I think we're all very fortunate to have you here.
Thank you, Ed. I often say to God, I don't think I'd want to be anyplace else than where you put me. I think I am where I belong. So, and I think maybe that's part of what we're supposed to come away from a story like Jacob's story. Now we're going to get to Joseph, and Joseph is going to be more like Abraham. We're going to say, I could never have gone through what Joseph went through. And yet turned out the way Joseph turned out. But Jacob, I can identify with Jacob. I can say I'm very Jacob-like. So, okay, time is about up. I still did most of the talking. Anything you want to say? I'd be very interested to see what you see in all of this. You ever wondered how come you are where you are, and how come things have happened in your life the way they happened? And you sure don't want to draw the conclusion that because of the things that happened, God is saying, I'm no good, or God is saying he has, in these stories, we see the main characters, and yet around them are lots of people that are part of the story. And the story couldn't have happened the way it happened if those people had not been usable by God.
Yeah.
Any reaction to all that? Some of the things are interesting. We have Ishmael and Isaac, and yet when Abraham dies, Ishmael and Isaac come together and bury him. And I like the way the scripture will say he lived long years, and in effect it says he had a good life, and God gathered him to his people. So same thing with Jacob. when Isaac dies, Jacob and Esau bury their father. Did they bury the hatchet? I don't think they did, but they did bury their father. You know, the prophecy that God gave about them said they would always be at odds. Ishmael would be at odds with his brothers, and Esau would be at odds with his brothers. And the warfare between their descendants goes on and on. Mm-hmm. And yet, in all of it, God is involved. God is at work. God is doing what he chooses to do, sometimes in a very mysterious way, sometimes in a very obvious way, but always God is involved.
You know, often when I think back, John, I look back at my life, and as I was going through it, it seemed somewhat of a jumble. Each time I had sort of a purpose, a reason, a direction, but then a different purpose. Right?
Yeah.
And then I would look back, and I started off with this interest in astronomy, and then in physics, and then I went from outer space to inner space for penny sakes, and there's all these reasons in between. Yeah. And then I ended up doing the type of work I never wanted to do in psychology, and yet I loved it, working with people with cancer. Yeah. And then I think, and I can say what you said, I felt that it was what God wanted of me in my life. Yeah. But it seemed to me like it was like a tapestry. You're only looking at, you have this woman who's an artist embroidering this tapestry, and all I'm seeing is the backside, these loose threads and this tangle, this jumble, right, there's a mess. But then in the end, as I look back, it seemed to, you get a glimpse of the other side of this tapestry where it all makes sense. Yeah. And it wasn't my hand that directed all this, and a lot of it seemed like just random chance. Sometimes a small decision ended up being life-changing. Yeah. You know, I never expected it. Yeah. It's interesting that way, and you can see the hand of God at work that way in our lives.
Yeah, I think, you know, the Bible is a whole book, and you say, well, the New Testament is certainly much more critical to us than the Old Testament. That's true. But there'd be no New Testament if there wasn't the preparation that God made through the Old Testament. You know, we say Jesus is that long-waited for Messiah. If there wasn't any long-waited for, what would it be the sense of there being the Messiah? You know, it's all part of a whole story. From Genesis to Revelation is a whole story, and it didn't begin it begins at Genesis because it goes back to creation. But a lot of things we're not told, but the things we are told helps us to see God is there. God is carrying out his plan, and at times it becomes very apparent to the people he's working with. But at other times there are years pass, and they don't know that God is at work, but he is. And when the book of Revelation closes, God doesn't go away. He's just putting out there something to help us. And there'll be all these years, there still are years now, and maybe there'll be more years, and maybe God is wrapping it up. That's God's choice, not ours. But anyway, the book of Genesis does get us started strongly to say God is not just this mighty force that created a universe out of nothing. God is a personal force that creates people. Not only makes the physical person come about, but creates the character, the person within that person. And he has his ways of doing it. We don't understand all of them. We sometimes don't appreciate all of them. But we see that they're there. Okay. Thank you all for your sharing and listening. And if you have something to say to this, I'd really like to hear it. If you don't, we'll just share together. So let's close. Father, we thank you for your word. Thank you for revealing yourself to us. There's no way we could have come to know who and what you are without your choice to reveal yourself to us and to pick out certain people and by your actions and interactions with them to reveal yourself to all people. So we thank you for Abraham and for Isaac. We thank you for Jacob, confusing as his stories are in places, yet we thank you that you put your hand to him and you made of him the turning point of this family becoming a big family, a significant family. So bless us with the ability to see what you're doing in our lives. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.